13 murders, roughly 50 rapes, more than 120 burglaries spread across at least 10 California counties, committed across 12 years between 1974 and 1986. For 4 decades, the man who did all of this had no face. What he had instead were 3 different names, each assigned by a different set of detectives in a different part of the state, none of whom understood for years that they were chasing the same person. In the farm towns of the Central Valley, he was called the Visalia Ransacker. In the bedroom suburbs of Sacramento, he became the East Area Rapist, a name that made grown adults bolt their windows in summer heat. And in the coastal cities of Southern California, where the attacks turned to murder, he was known as the original Night Stalker. 3 names, 1 man, and for 40 years, no one could put a face to any of them. When the answer finally came in April of 2018, it did not arrive the way anyone expected. There was no deathbed confession. There was no fingerprint pulled from an old evidence box. There was no informant who finally talked. The answer came from a stranger's saliva. DNA that belonged not to the killer, but to people who shared a sliver of his ancestry. People who had never met him, who had spit into a tube and uploaded their results to a hobbyist genealogy website to learn about their great-grandparents. That is what it took. Not a detective's hunch, not a witness who came forward. A family tree, built backward by people who collect ancestors the way others collect stamps. This is the story of how the most notorious unsolved serial case in American history was finally closed, and the far harder story of why it stayed open for 40 years when, in principle, it never had to. But before the names, before the method, before the man, there are the people he erased. Because this case is almost always told as a puzzle, a cold case cracked, a triumph of new technology. And it is that. But it is first and last a story about lives that were interrupted, and about hundreds of survivors who waited 4 decades for a single answer. So begin where any honest account of this man should begin. Begin with them. Begin with a journalism professor who taught at a community college, and who, on an ordinary September night, heard a noise and got up to protect his daughter. Begin with a young couple who were last seen alive walking their dog through a quiet neighborhood, doing the most unremarkable thing 2 people can do. Begin with an attorney and his wife settled into a comfortable home, who had every reason to believe the night would pass like any other. Begin with an 18-year-old girl months away from the rest of her adult life, who would never get to live it. These were not characters in a mystery. They were people with addresses and routines and people who loved them. And for every one of them who died, there were others who survived. Women who lived for decades, knowing the man who attacked them in their own bedrooms was still out there somewhere, free, unnamed, and never caught. They aged, they raised children, they moved cities, and the question never left them. Some of them carried it for 40 years before anyone could answer it. That is the weight this story has to carry. So hold it, even as the facts demand that we understand how it happened. Because the most damning thing about this case is not what the killer did in the dark. It is what the institutions failed to do in the light. For most of the years this man was active, the official posture, the tidy institutional account, was that these were separate problems, different cases, different jurisdictions, different theories about different criminals. In Visalia, the early break-ins were treated as a local nuisance, a property crime headache for a small-town police department. Up in Sacramento County, the rapes were a regional terror handled by suburban departments that struggled to share even basic intelligence across city lines. And down in Southern California, the murders were worked by yet another constellation of agencies, hundreds of miles away, with their own files, their own task forces, and their own suspect lists. The accepted story, the comfortable story, was that these were unrelated crimes committed by unrelated men. It was a clean account. It was also wrong. The cost of being wrong was measured in human lives and in decades of fear. To understand how one offender slipped through the gaps between all those agencies, you have to go back to where it started, not with a body, but with a series of break-ins that almost no one took seriously. It began around 1974 in Visalia, a city in the agricultural heart of the San Joaquin Valley. An intruder started entering homes at night. Over time, the burglaries piled up, well over 100 of them by some counts, and from the start there was something off about them. This was not a thief working for money. He took trivial things, a single earring from a pair, a photograph, small personal items that had value to no one but the people they belonged to. And he left signs of having lingered. He rearranged belongings. He moved objects, opened drawers, handled the private things in a stranger's house, and left them disturbed in a way that told the victims unmistakably that someone had been there and had wanted them to know it. It was methodical. It was intrusive. And viewed with the hindsight investigators would later be forced to apply, it was escalating. The behavior carried a signature, a way of operating that detectives in other counties years later would recognize with a chill. But in 1974, in a small police department with no reason to imagine what was coming, it was filed away as ordinary property crime. Nobody knew they were watching the opening act of something far worse. That changed on the night of September 11, 1975, when the burglar became a killer. Claude Snelling was a journalism professor at the College of the Sequoias, a local institution where he taught young people how to write, how to ask questions, how to report the truth. By every account, he was an ordinary, decent man, the kind of father whose presence in a house was a quiet, steady fact. That night, an intruder slipped onto the Snelling property and attempted to abduct Claude's teenage daughter from her own home, dragging her toward the back of the house. Claude heard the disturbance. He did what almost any parent would do. He confronted the man who was taking his child, and the man shot him. Claude Snelling died on his own property in the act of protecting his daughter, killed by a stranger who then fled into the dark and vanished. Sit with that for a moment, because it matters. This was not a puzzle piece. This was a man who died defending another human being, an innocent killed in the act of shielding another innocent. The murder was real, it was proven, and it was devastating to a family and a community. And yet for decades, it sat in isolation. It was not connected to the larger pattern that was about to unfold 300 miles to the north. To the investigators of the time, it was a terrible local tragedy, a single homicide tied loosely to a string of burglaries. They could not see what they were looking at because the thing they were looking at had not yet revealed its full shape. The man who killed Claude Snelling was not finished. He was only beginning, and he was about to move. By 1976, the crime shifted north to the suburbs east of Sacramento, and they took on a new and more terrifying form. An attacker began entering homes at night and assaulting women in their own bedrooms. Over the next few years, he would commit dozens of these attacks across a sprawl of suburban communities. What set this series apart, what made it so distinct that it eventually defined itself as a single offender's work, was the cold deliberateness of his method and the fact that he frequently struck when a male partner was present in the home. He did not avoid the husband or the boyfriend. He incorporated them into the cruelty. He would bind the man, separate him, and terrorize both. The press of the era gave him a name that spread through the region like a contagion, the East Area Rapist. And the fear he generated was not abstract. It was documented, immediate, physical. Neighborhoods that had never thought about locks installed deadbolts and bought firearms. Couples slept in shifts. Men sat up at night with shotguns across their laps, listening to the house settle, jumping at the sound of a fence gate. An entire region of California learned to be afraid of the dark in their own homes. What the surviving accounts and case files describe is an offender who did not improvise. He prepared. He surveilled the houses he chose, sometimes for considerable time beforehand, learning the routines of the people inside, the layout of the rooms, the way in, and the way out. He entered at night, when his victims were most vulnerable and most disoriented. He used ligatures to bind, and he relied on staged objects as instruments of control. One of the documented tactics was to balance dishes on the back of a bound victim and warn that if he heard them fall, he would kill. It was a method designed to extend terror across hours, to make the victim the warden of their own fear. And then there was the detail that, more than any other, marked the psychology of the man. He often called his victims afterward. Days, weeks, sometimes years later, the phone would ring, and the voice on the other end would remind them that he remembered, that he could find them again, that the violation had no clean ending. It is a pattern that appears in the record again and again, and it is left here without embellishment, because the cruelty of it requires no adjectives. The facts are enough. For a time, the rapes and the burglaries and the single Visalia murder remained, in the eyes of the agencies working them, separate problems with no formal thread connecting them. But the man behind them was changing again. The escalation that had carried him from rearranging strangers' belongings to assaulting people in their beds was not finished, and it would reach its most terrible conclusion in the southern half of the state. Beginning in 1979, in Goleta near Santa Barbara, the series turned to murder. And then it kept turning, through Ventura, through Dana Point, through Irvine, leaving behind a trail of homicides that a fourth set of investigators would work as yet another distinct, unconnected case. The pattern in the South was specific and merciless. He targeted couples in their homes. A physician, Dr. Robert Offerman, and a woman, Deborah Manning, were killed together. An attorney, Lyman Smith, and his wife, Charlene, were murdered in their own house. Keith and Patrice Harrington, a young married couple, were killed in a gated community where they should have been safe. Cherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez died in Goleta. Each of these was a household erased, a future ended, a phone that would never ring with their voices again. And the southern agencies, like the northern ones before them, worked these murders as a regional series unto itself. They called the unknown man the original Night Stalker, with no formal link drawn back to the East Area rapist, and no thread reaching all the way down to a burglar in Visalia or a journalism professor who died on his porch. The last known murder in the series came in May 1986 in Irvine. The victim was Janelle Cruz. She was 18 years old, just months from the rest of her life, killed in her own home. And then, abruptly, the killings stopped. The man who had terrorized California for more than a decade simply went quiet. And for the next 32 years, the question of who he was sat unanswered across 3 regions and at least 4 sets of files that no one had yet placed side by side on the same desk. The institutions held all the pieces. What they did not have for most of 2 decades was anything that compelled them to assemble those pieces into the shape of one man. Consider what that meant for the people left behind. Across Northern California, dozens of women lived with the knowledge that the man who had broken into their homes, bound their partners, and assaulted them had never been caught, and might, for all they knew, still be watching. In the South, families buried their dead and waited for an arrest that did not come. The years stacked up. Children of murdered couples grew into adults who had never known their parents. Survivors moved, changed their locks a dozen times, slept with weapons within reach, flinched at the sound of a ringing telephone. The institutional posture for most of this period was, in effect, that these were separate problems. 3 open files, 3 theories, 3 pools of suspects, 3 task forces that came and went as budgets allowed. It was a tidy account. It was also wrong. The first crack in that fragmentation came not from a confession and not from a witness, but from a laboratory. By 2001, forensic DNA testing had advanced far enough to do what 20 years of detective work across county lines had not. Investigators compared biological evidence preserved from the Northern California rape series against evidence from the Southern California murders, and the result was unambiguous. The same man had committed both. The East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were one offender. The assumption that had organized the entire investigation The belief that these were distinct criminals operating in distinct regions collapsed in a single afternoon of comparison. It should have been a triumph. In one sense, it was, for the first time, the true scope of the case was visible. A single predator had carried a campaign of burglary, rape, and murder across at least 10 counties over more than a decade. But the science that proved he existed could not name him. The DNA profile, now confirmed as belonging to one man, was run against every law enforcement database available. It matched no one. The man had never been convicted of a felony that would have placed his genetic profile in the system. He had no entry in any of the databases the police were permitted to search. They now possessed the most complete possible biological signature of their offender, and it pointed at an empty seat. They knew, with scientific certainty, that he was out there. They simply had no way to read his name out of the evidence they held. So the case entered a strange new phase. It was no longer a question of whether the crimes were connected. That was settled. It was a question of identity, and the identity was locked inside a molecule that matched nothing. Years passed again. Investigators who had carried the case for most of their careers retired or aged toward retirement with the files still open on their desks. Composite sketches that had circulated since the 70s grew yellow and dated. The public, for the most part, forgot. A serial murder of staggering reach had faded into the category of unsolved cases that true crime hobbyists traded theories about online, and the general public no longer feared. Into that quiet stepped a writer named Michelle McNamara. She was not a detective and never claimed to be. She was a journalist and a researcher with an obsessive, methodical mind, and she became consumed by the case in a way few professionals had the freedom to be. In 2013, in a magazine article, she gave the offender the name that would finally stick, the Golden State Killer. It was an act of synthesis as much as branding, a recognition that the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, and the original Night Stalker were facets of one man who belonged to the whole state, not to any single jurisdiction that had failed to catch him. She corresponded with retired investigators, pored over old files, mapped the crimes, and chased leads through the night while her family slept. It is important to frame her honestly, because the popular telling sometimes overstates her role. Michelle McNamara did not solve the case. She did something arguably as valuable in a different register. She refused to let it die. She dragged a forgotten horror back into public consciousness and reminded a generation that the man was real and, in all likelihood, still alive and still free. She did not live to see the end of the story she had devoted herself to. She died unexpectedly in 2016, with the case still open and the killer still unnamed. Her book, assembled from her research after her death, entitled I'll Be Gone in the Dark, was published in early 2018, just weeks before the breakthrough that would finally close the question she had spent years asking. And here's the detail that turns the whole case on its axis, the thing that should make anyone watching lean forward. The DNA that named no one in any police database, the profile that had matched an empty seat for 17 years, was about to match dozens of strangers. Not in a law enforcement system. In a place the police were never designed to use, never trained to search, and at the time were not even certain they were allowed to. The man who had hidden inside the gaps between agencies for decades was about to be exposed by people who had never met him, never lived near him, and in most cases had no idea his blood ran anywhere near their own family tree. If you want to understand how a hobbyist family tree website rewrote the rules of forensic investigation, and how a case cold for 40 years cracked open in a matter of weeks, subscribe now, because what comes next is the part that changed how every cold case in the country is worked. The mechanism was simple to describe and revolutionary in effect, and it began with a decision to upload a murderer's genetic code to a website built for people curious about their ancestors. Investigators took the crime scene DNA profile, the one that had matched nothing for so long, and submitted it to a public genealogy database called GEDmatch, a site where ordinary people uploaded the results of their own consumer DNA tests, hoping to find cousins and fill in the branches of their family trees. The profile did not find Joseph James DeAngelo on that site. He had never uploaded his DNA. What it found instead were people who shared fragments of it, distant relatives, third and fourth cousins, scattered across the country, most of whom had never heard the name DeAngelo and had no idea that the saliva of a serial killer was quietly intersecting with their own ancestry. It was not a match to a man. It was a match to a family. And from a family, with enough patience, you can find a man. That work fell to a genetic genealogist, Barbara Ray Venter, who led the painstaking construction of family trees radiating outward from those distant cousins. This is the part that deserves to be stated precisely because it is routinely misunderstood. The DNA did not point a finger and say a name. It gave investigators a branch, a shared set of ancestors several generations back, and from that branch, genealogists worked forward through marriages, births, and census records, building an enormous web of descendants. Then they narrowed. They used the estimated age of the offender, the geography of the crimes, the physical description survivors had given decades earlier. Branch by branch, name by name, they eliminated the people who could not have done it until the tree closed in on a small number of living men who fit, and then it closed on one. He was in his early 70s, living a quiet suburban life near Sacramento, the kind of ordinary you walk past without a second glance. But a name from a family tree is not evidence. The genealogy generated a lead, nothing more, and everyone involved understood that. To establish identity to a legal standard, investigators needed his actual DNA, lawfully obtained, compared directly to the crime scene profile. So they did what cold case investigators have long done. They waited, and they collected what he discarded, reported to be a sample from his car door handle, and later a tissue thrown away. Those samples were tested against the profile that had haunted 10 counties for 4 decades. They matched. It was the confirmation, not the genealogy, that established who he was. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights. One of the most notorious unsolved serial cases in American history ended not with a chase or a confession, but with a quiet knock and a suburban lawn. And then came the detail that turns the institutional failure from tragedy into something closer to indictment. DeAngelo was a Navy veteran who had served in Vietnam, and he had been a police officer. He worked for the Exeter Department in the early 1970s and the Auburn Department from 1976 to 1979. He was fired after he was caught shoplifting a hammer and a can of dog repellent. His years in law enforcement overlapped directly with the crime spree. A man trained in police procedure had operated inside the very blind spots that procedure left open. Sit with the shape of that. The DNA that convicted him had existed for years. The science to link the series existed by 2001. What was missing was never the evidence. It was a method to read it and the will to fund the people who would. The right database simply was not a police one. This was not a mystery that defeated investigators. It was a structure that defeated coordination, a serial offender who crossed county and departmental lines that did not share data, theories, or suspect lists. There were real near misses, too. A Visalia detective had once encountered the ransacker during a stakeout and reportedly exchanged gunfire as the suspect fled into the dark. Composite sketches circulated for years. Tips were generated and never run to ground across agencies that did not talk to one another. These were genuine leads degraded by time, jurisdiction, and the limits of the era, not one missed smoking gun, but 1,000 small fractures in a system that treated one predator as a dozen separate local problems. On June 29, 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and admitted to additional kidnappings and dozens of rapes that had passed beyond the statute of limitations. His guilt for these crimes is not inference. It is proven by his own words in open court. In August of that year, he was sentenced to multiple consecutive terms of life without the possibility of parole. And over days of victim impact statements, the survivors and the families finally did what 40 years had denied them. They stood and spoke directly to the man who had taken so much, returning the weight of the story to where it always belonged, not to the offender, but to the people he had tried to erase. So return to them now. Claude Snelling, the journalism professor, shot dead defending his daughter. Dr. Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning, Lyman and Charlene Smith, Keith and Patrice Harrington, Cherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez, Janelle Cruz, 18 years old, months from the rest of her life. The answer came, but it came too late for them, and far too late for the families who buried questions instead of getting them. What remains is not the headline mystery of who. That is answered definitively, and it should be honored as solved. What remains is everything the answer could not undo. The survivors still living inside what was done to them, the crimes that may never be cleanly attributed, and a national argument the case set loose about privacy, consent, and the ethics of searching a hobbyist's family tree to catch a killer. The case was solvable in principle for years before anyone reached for the method that cracked it. The institutions had to choose to reach. So here's the question worth leaving you with, and worth your honest answer below. If the same technique can catch a monster who hid for 40 years, where exactly should the line be drawn on using a stranger's DNA? Uploaded to find cousins? To hunt someone they never knew? Tell me where you land. And when you've decided, stay with us for the next case, where another tidy official story is about to meet the record that was waiting to undo it.